Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In today's video what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going over some information, well, maybe some information, we don't know, let's see, that's come out over the last few days regarding Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. Now the information comes from an interview that was done with producer Yoshinori Kitase and co-director Naoki Hamaguchi. And this interview was done at the CEDC Plus 2020 online convention, which has been held over the last few days. Now, they go on to talk quite a bit about Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, and as usual, that's been translated by the amazing Audrey over on Twitter. If you're not following it yet, why not? Get over there. And what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to go through everything that's kind of been translated on there, and just try and get any information that we can, as far as the future of Final Fantasy VII Remake goes. So let's jump straight into it. Now, the first question is a pretty general one. It's one that they've answered quite a bit, and that was how did Remake become an actual project? How did it come about? And the response is pretty standard, and Kitase goes on to say it was a decision made after speaking with Nomura and Hashimoto. In particular, Hashimoto mentioned that he'd always wanted to make a game like Advent Children, and it became a project after a lot of discussion between them. He goes on to say that a lot of people thought that the first promotional video for Remake was for like another movie along the lines of Advent Children, and that when they put the logo at the end, the proper Final Fantasy VII logo, a lot of people kind of realised that it was going to be a game. And yeah, to be fair, my initial thoughts when I saw that promotional video were, here we go, we're getting another movie. Hamaguchi goes on to explain how they adapted real-time gameplay for the remake, as opposed to the ATB system in the original game, and how they were able to combine command battle and action battle seamlessly into one system. And I've got to be honest with you, that as someone who loved the original system and as someone who preferred, I do prefer the turn-based entries in the franchise, the older ones. I've got to say, this combat system in Remake, it was much better than any combat system recently that I've seen in the franchise, in my opinion at least. It definitely gives you the control over the characters. You get that moment to think when you're going through the ATB selections, but it doesn't let you just, you still have to partake in the action side of the combat. I never really played it on classic mode, so I don't really know too much about what that entails. I might give it a run. I might do a run on classic mode one day. Who knows? And yeah, Kitase, he goes on to say that that the new people who'd played the original would want those elements of that classic battle system. So, it is really good that they've put that in there and worked it in a way that, even in like the normal and hard mode, it's still in there, it's integral to the combat. You need to use it. You still need to interact with the menus. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that. It is one of the things that surprised me the most positively about Remake, because I had a lot of concerns going into it about the combat system, and yeah, they nailed it. It was good. It was good. I enjoyed it. The next question was about any specific know-how that they used to create Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Kitase just kind of responded that it's a twofold process: have great programmers and have good communication between Nomura and Hamaguchi and the rest of the team. And then he seems to say, according to this translation by Audrey, he seems to say, don't be a yes man to Nomura, which I absolutely love. Yeah, that's good stuff. Audrey then goes on to say that Hamaguchi had quite a lot to say on the organisation of the developers and how to appoint various staff as managers of their own teams. He also said that some of the assets are done by third-party companies and that they had to oversee those creators and things like that. Now, the next question is, how did they go about deciding on the game's design? And Hamaguchi says that he joined in pretty much in the middle of the development, and he asked Kitase and Nomura what kind of game it was that they wanted to make. And Kitase's said that he wanted to use Advent Children graphics, and Nomura wanted to have a story-driven game. Which, I definitely get the Advent Children graphics thing, that sort of style, that sort of vibe. I'm not so much talking about the fidelity and the quality of the graphics, because, that's obviously something that they're talking about, but it's not just that, it's the same kind of style and vibe in a lot of ways, and yeah, they've definitely stuck to that. Now, the next comment's a little bit concerning for me. Hamaguchi says that they didn't think it was necessary to create an open world for Remake, as long as there was a story-driven game. That's a bit of an indication that it is going to be we don't get to travel around on the world map on the open world or anything like that. It is very much going to be areas with cutscenes or travel sequences between them, loading screens, basically. The next question goes on to ask how it was working with Tetsuya Nomura as the director. And Hamaguchi says that he was particular with the portrayal of the characters, which definitely comes across as a Nomura trait for me. He absolutely loves the characters in his writing. He's all about developing them. And while a lot of people may not agree with some of the paths and directions that he takes, sometimes with the story, you've got to admit that he definitely does put a lot of focus on the characters. And also, Kitase comes across and says that he was quite particular with the voice acting, which, it makes a lot of sense. You want the voice that you're hearing to convey the emotions that the scene needs. It's, there's too many games out there where, someone's really phoned in the voice acting job, and I can't say that that was the case with anyone in the first part of Remake. So yeah, you can see that focus coming through. And then Kitase goes on to say that an interesting part that they talked about was where would the characters put their weapons? Where would Aerith pull the staff from? We did talk a lot about the placement of equipment and armors. That's an aesthetic thing, really. It's not... It's nice, but it doesn't really give us any, information. So, yeah, I'm going to skip over that one. Hamaguchi says next that the original game doesn't really have a concept of time. However, when making everything realistic, they also had to think about, night cycles and people sleeping and overnight and what kind of things would happen during that time. And I do think that they added kind of a feeling, a sense of night and day into Remake quite well. It definitely isn't present in the original game. Do you know what I mean? You have that sensation that time's progressing, but it's not really segmented into days. It's just kind of the progress of the game, and what happens with the story gives you that vibe. There's a couple of moments where, you're kind of given a specific time frame. For example, after everything goes pear-shaped at the North Crater, and spoilers, Cloud gives Sephiroth the Black Materia, Tifa and Barrett then wake up at Junon. They've been imprisoned, and I'm sure I remember Barrett saying something like it's been about 3 days, something like that they've been there for. So there were a few examples where you're given concepts of time, but not that often, and it is something that I did appreciate about Remake, definitely. Now the next bit, the interviewer says, I know you can't say much about Remake Part 2, but what's a goal for you in Part 2? Hamaguchi comes back with Part 1 was focused in Midgar, and the players were able to intimately feel what Midgar was like. And for Part 2, what they want is us as the gamer to experience what the rest of the world feels like in that manner. So it seems like they're definitely going to be looking at putting the same level of detail and expansion and things like that they put into Midgar for the first part of Remake. They're definitely looking to put that into every installment going forwards, which I wouldn't have expected anything less, to be fair. That was fully expected. And then Kitase comes in and says, although those who played the original game know the story, they're probably thinking, what's going to happen now? And believe me, you're right, mate. We want to create something that can surprise them and that they can enjoy, that lives up to their expectations. We did something similar in Part 1. I will give them credit. Midgar was really well done. There was a lot of room for expansion. I've done a series on it. You know my thoughts if you watch any of my videos previously. There are a lot of spots where they could have done a better job, where I think they've done a worse job than the original game, things like that. But on the whole, it was an enjoyable experience. I can definitely see what he's saying here, that they're trying to do something that surprises people but still lives up to their expectations. And to a degree with Part 1, yeah, I agree. It lived up to my expectations in a lot of ways, but then in other ways it still kind of let me down. But it did manage to surprise me at the end with that twist. So, sort of. I'll let you have that one, Kitase. Sort of. Now, all of those comments come from Audrey's Twitter. From what I can understand, she was watching the event live, so she was kind of typing things down as it went on. What she's done afterwards is, it seems like she's gone back and created a little bit more of an in-depth dive into what they said. There are some sections here that seem like we missed them in that thread. I might just not be using Twitter properly. You never know. It's possible. So in this image here, we've got, from the top, we've got Hamaguchi coming in with, when creating Final Fantasy VII Remake, they decided to have the entire game take place in Midgar and create a realistic world in that setting. For example, in the original game, you don't really have a sense of what it is like to gaze up at the plate from the viewpoint of the character, and it's something that you were able to visualise in Remake. And in Part 2, they want to take that type of detail and allow us as the gamer to experience how we saw Midgar in Remake with the rest of the world. Now that seems to elaborate on a point that we've already covered in the original Twitter thread, about how they want to take the same sort of, I want to say, sense of grandeur and perspective. They want to take, those feelings and kind of expand it out into the entire world. And this is another thing that kind of indicates two things to me. The first thing that it indicates is that we are probably going to see at least 4 parts to this story, because in order for them to do this, in order for them to expand each area to the size and the scope and the scale and the detail of Midgar, we're going to see areas become absolutely humongous compared to what they used to be, compared to what we, experienced them as in the original game. I mean, for example, the very first thing that we're going to come to now after we've left Midgar is the calm flashback. That calm flashback took quite a while in the original game. Now, if you think about the scale that the same sort of segment was expanded to in Remake, we could be looking at potentially the entire first 2 or 3 hours of the game being that flashback and what goes on. So, like the journey to calm, the actual flashback itself, the party decompressing and talking about what's gone on in the flashback. There's also a lot of potential for things to pan out differently. Like in the original game, we didn't have any of the prior knowledge that seems to be going on now, whereas we've got that prior knowledge coming from certain characters like Aerith. Red 13 knows the deal. Pretty much everyone knows what's going on now. They all got flashbacks during that fight at the end of Remake. So we could definitely see the calm flashback pan out differently to how it does in the original game. So, I mean, if you think about that calm, that's like 2 or 3 hours, you expand that out to each area, and we're probably hitting the 30-hour, 35-hour mark around, I'd say somewhere in between the Gold Saucer and Nibelheim. Somewhere in that region there, that's where this part is probably going to end, if we believe what they're saying right now. And it's something that I've thought for quite a while based off a few things that Nomura said as well. It does seem like this second part of Remake is going to come to a close somewhere in that pocket between the Gold Saucer and Nibelheim. Hamaguchi says that that's all that you can reveal about Part 2 right now, but Kitase goes on to say, like, those who played the original game know what happens in the story, they're curious to what will happen now. However, because they know the story, it gives them the opportunity to deliver something that we expect, but that also allows us as gamers to think, oh, so this is what actually happened. And that also shows us something that will surprise us and go beyond our expectations. Now, this is kind of, again, elaborating on a previous comment that we've already kind of gone over. He goes on to say, because we have the original game already, if we can express these elements well, it can turn into something that users can definitely look forwards to. We did this in Part 1 too. For those who played Part 1, they already have an idea of what kind of game we are making. Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. And yeah, he goes on to say he wants to make a game that lives up to our expectations, but also throws us off the trail and surprises us and subverts us. And again, like I say, that kind of plays into what's already been said. It does seem like we're gonna get the same story, but there's going to be a lot of differences in it. So we're probably going to follow the same journey, go to the same places in the same order. Roughly the same events are going to happen, but there are going to be differences. And there were a lot of spaces in the original game where you could have added more content. You could see that they were limited. I mean, you've got to remember, like, that original game was bursting at the seams on 3 discs. It was the first time that anything had ever been done like that, really. Do you know what I mean? And so there's definitely things that they will have left out in the original game that would have added a lot more context to the events of the original game that we're hopefully going to get now. But there's also going to be that layer of, this is a new story. It's going to be interesting to see how they knit that together. There's been some concerns. I do have a few concerns, but I'm definitely along for the journey. 100%. Now, the interviewer then goes on to say that in Final Fantasy XIII, shudder, a lot of the map consisted of a set pathway. It was very linear, but then in the latter half of the game, it opens up into a large map, which was Grand Pulse. The interviewer says that they really enjoyed that aspect and hope that that's something that happens for Part 2. Everyone laughs, and Hamaguchi says that he'll take a note of that, things like that. So, I don't know what we're going to get. I'm so confused as to what we're going to get. Like, they're saying things that are making me think we're not going to get an open world, and it's going to be similar to, like, Final Fantasy X's journey system, where, like, areas would just kind of link into each other pretty directly. But other than that, you had the airship, and you had a list that you could select from where you wanted to go. Like, I'm not too sure which we're going to get. And Hamaguchi then goes on to say that while he can't really give us any details about Part 2, that there was a bit of a change internally among the staff. Now, he says that when they were creating the first part, most of the staff who wanted to work on the team were fans of the original game. However, now the new staff who want to work on the game are those who played Remake and want to be on board for this new story. And he says that it's pretty cool to see this new wave of staff. That's an interesting comment. Like, I don't know how to take that. I don't know whether to take that as in the old staff are still there, the ones who wanted to play on, the fans of the original who wanted to work on it, they're still there, and now you've got this additional wave of new staff. I think that's what he means, but the wording of it almost makes me feel like there's been a bit of a shift, and that the people who are fans of the original game aren't as enamoured with it, and the people who are fans of Remake are the ones that want to work on Remake Part 2. I think it's the first one. I think it's going to be a case of that everyone, they've just had a massive influx of new interest in the franchise in Final Fantasy VII because of Remake. I kind of feel like that's what he's saying, so I'm going to run with that. That's what he's saying. The MC then goes to ask, for those who like the original game, do they have any specific thoughts on the development? So it seems like the interviewers kind of thought the same thing that I thought there. Like, oh, are the original game's fans not happy? What are they saying? What are their thoughts? Hamaguchi comes in and says that one thing that pops into his mind is action battle. That these people experienced a new type of action battle system, and that they want to contribute to that system too. And that they definitely contribute different ideas that allow the team to create new surprises and new additions to the battle system. So it seems like we are going to see some tweaks and improvements to the battle system of Final Fantasy VII Remake. I just hope that they don't do anything too dramatic to it, because, like I say, I thought it was a really good battle system. I've played better, obviously, but I wasn't sat there thinking, this battle system's rubbish. There was never a moment when I thought that. The only annoying thing really was losing your ATBs. When you get interrupted when you select an ATB action and you lose that ATB segment. I think you should at least keep half of it or something like that. Just something, because obviously you're going to get interrupted when you're doing attacks. It's up to you to avoid getting interrupted. But I don't think it should take all of it away. It's a bit much. Maybe in hard mode take all of it away. In normal mode though, where it's a slightly more chilled experience, maybe like half of it. I don't know. And then the final part of this is, the question was, is there any element that was borrowed from Final Fantasy XV and put within Final Fantasy VII Remake? And Hamaguchi says that they did add personality to the Midgar slums by having it feel lived in, with NPC characters talking about random topics as you walk around the, whatever area that you're in. The team wanted to create a story-driven game that immersed the player within the Final Fantasy VII world. So it wasn't necessarily influenced by 15. And yeah, that's what I'd say. I wouldn't say that there's any direct influence from Final Fantasy 15 to Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's more of an influence just in general. These are the things that they're capable of doing now. They're capable of having these NPCs in areas talking about what's going on in the world and things like that. Previously, hardware wouldn't really allow it, whereas now it is possible. And the final question here says that usually for video games, each team wants to one-up the previous game that came before it. Did you have any of that sentiment when making 7 Remake in comparison to 15? And Hamaguchi's answer is, we talked about dividing the story into parts earlier in this interview. Regarding that, since the original game's story, characters and world is so vast, it's difficult to properly convey everything in the remake. If we want to tell the entire story, we have to do it in parts. However, if we're going to divide the story, there might be some parts that feel that they're missing something or are being spread too thin. In order to avoid this, since Remake is going to be divided, we're able to focus on each part and make it even better than how it was portrayed in the original game, which makes for a completely new gaming experience. Which, that's him saying no, as far as I can see, to that question. So I don't think there was any kind of expectation to try and one-up Final Fantasy 15. I think what they're trying to one-up is the original Final Fantasy 7, and that's going to be a tough job. So far, not even close, but yeah, that's me. But I do like that kind of approach. That approach should lead to good results. They're taking each segment of the original game and trying to expand and improve upon it. I'm just a bit concerned that they're adding a bit too much fluff in the way of that in some circumstances, but hopefully they get better at it as the Remake Project progresses. And as far as comparing 7 Remake to 15, I mean, let's be fair, every single game in the franchise since Final Fantasy VII has been trying to live up to Final Fantasy VII, 15 included, and none of them have managed it. So I don't see why Remake would shoot for Final Fantasy 15. It's going to be shooting for the original game. It's going to try and be a better version of that original game, because regardless of the context and the sneaky undertones of Remake and what kind of meaning you take from that, it is either way remaking that world, remaking those characters, remaking that story for us to experience now. So it makes sense that it's trying to live up and to surpass Final Fantasy VII rather than Final Fantasy 15. And that's about it. That's everything that was covered in the interview, at least. There might be some more to come. I'm not too sure. I'm going to keep an eye on Audrey's Twitter over the next few days. And if there is more that comes out from this interview, I'll definitely throw it down and get a video done about it. But the main things that I took from that video is, A, just in the previous comment, that they're trying definitely to surpass Final Fantasy VII, and they're using that as kind of like the marker post, which I don't think they're going to manage it, but it makes sense to use that as the marker post, and it should, it should give us good results. It can only be a good thing, I'm sure. But the other thing that I kind of took from it was how the rest of the remake is going to be structured and how many parts we're going to get. And it just kind of confirms, like previously, earlier on in the year, earlier on in 2020, Nomura came out and said that they want to break it up into smaller parts so that they can get these installments out quicker in the detail and things like that they want to do and expand on it properly, rather than just having one monstrous 200-hour game after Midgar, or even including Midgar. And this interview definitely confirms that for me. It's really making me believe that this game is not going to go any further than Nibelheim. Like, Nibelheim is going to be the very furthest they go with this. And I'm starting to think they may not even reach there. I mean, previously in my prediction video that, if you've not seen it, definitely go check it out. But previously in that video, I kind of predicted Gongaga, maybe Cosmo Canyon, maybe Nibelheim as the areas where I think it is going to finish. And like I say, this interview just 100% makes me feel that that is going to be the case. But what about you? What information did you get from this? Have you got any thoughts on what's been said here? Leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe for more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. We're definitely going to keep on going with that. Anytime anything comes out that's got a bit of substance to it, I'm definitely going to cover it. But more importantly than anything, have a great day.